Hi, I'm Old Norse specialist Dr. Jackson Crawford, and today I'm back for the second installment in my series of videos about the afterlife. This time, I'm talking about Odin's Hall for Fallen Heroes, Valhåll, better known in English as Valhalla. First, I ought to take a moment to explain the name. We usually call it Valhalla in English, as I've explained before, because during the 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries, translators often wanted to make feminine gender words in Old Norse look more feminine. And the main way they did that was by adding an A at the end that was not really there in Old Norse. This is how you get English language, German language, modern Scandinavian language works that give the name of the wife of Odin as Frigga rather than Frigg, or the underworld or its queen as Hela rather than Hel. This is also the origin of Valhalla rather than Valhåll. As far as the vowel in whole being changed to A in the word Valhalla, I think that probably has to do with the fact that the underlying vowel, anytime that there is one of those O caudatas, those hook O's in Old Norse, is always an A. So for example, the genitive singular of the word hall, hall, is hallar, meaning halls, the thing belonging to the hall. So since that's the underlying vowel, I suspect that's why that ended up just getting changed in this English language version, Valhalla. But because I like to give you the flavor of the original, in this video and elsewhere in my video series, I discuss it as Valhåll. Now the meaning of the word is pretty transparent, pretty straightforward. Hall is the Old Norse word for hall. We should keep in mind that this does not mean anything quite like hall typically means in English today, in the sense that of a hallway, say, but rather think of a feasting hall, right? This is a hall in the sense of a location for social activities in the Middle Ages, a place where feasting and drinking occurs, a place where a king or lord or god, in the case of Odin here, might receive his guests. And then Valr is a special Old Norse word for a dead body on the battlefield. There are different translations of that. The most common one in English is slain, but I like to emphasize the physicality of what it means as dead body on the battlefield. So the hall of dead bodies on the battlefield, the hall of men who have died in battle, is thus Valhåll. Now, of course, the heroes who die in battle and are brought to Valhåll are brought there by Odin's women servants, the Valkyries, or Valkyrior. I have recently posted a video discussing the Valkyries and some of my ideas about the origin of that concept, and I'll refer you to that for more information about them. I thought that was worth posting before the video about Valhåll so that you could get a clear idea of what their role is, because I think they probably do actually precede in age the concept of Valhåll. Now, I'm not the only person or the first person by any stretch of the imagination to suggest that Valhåll may actually not be a very old idea in the Norse mythos. One major reason for thinking this is that the oldest poem that mentions it is Atlakvida, probably from the early 800s. This is one of the heroic poems in the Poetic Edda. And in Atlakvida, Valhåll is just a hall. It's just the name of the hall of King Gunnar. It does not mean any kind of afterlife. And so that suggests that at that time, there was not yet a special meaning for this term that associated it with the afterlife. Instead, this was a sort of tongue-in-cheek way of referring to the hall of a war king, who of course is going to get a lot of men killed in the course of his pursuits. But by the 900s, by poetry we can confidently date to the 900s, such as the poem Eiríksmál and the Poetic Edda, or the two poems Eiríksmál and Hákonarmál that commemorate fallen Norwegian kings. We see that the concept of Valhåll is quite well developed. It is possible that it goes back to earlier than Atlakvida, in which case the reference in Atlakvida might be a joking allusion to Odin's Hall in the name of King Gunnar's Hall, but it's difficult to know for sure. The most physical, if you will, description of Valhåll is actually in the poem Grímnismál in the Poetic Edda. In this poem, Odin goes into a a sort of a rapture after he has been starved between two fires for 9 days. He is brought finally a drink of mead by the young son of the king who is tormenting him. And in exchange, Odin goes into what seems to be something of a trance, and he sees all these different worlds of and halls of the gods, and he discusses them in some detail, especially Valhåll. Let me give you that description as it stands in my translation of the Poetic Edda into English. The only thing I'm going to change from that published translation is I'm going to read the names in their Old Norse form. So I'll say, for instance, Valhåll, not Valhalla, Gladsheimr, not Gladsheim, or however you might pronounce the anglicized version of that. A fifth land is Gladsheimr, where gold-bright, wide Valhåll stands. That is where Odin chooses from the men killed by weapons every day. Valhåll is easily recognized if one comes to see it. The hall is held up by spear shafts. It is roofed by shields. Chainmail is on the benches. Valhåll is easily recognized if one comes to see it. A wolf hangs above the western door, and an eagle above him. Andhrimnir the cook lets the pork from Sahrimnir cook in the cauldron Eldhrimnir. There is no better meat, and there are few who know what the Einherjar eat. Battle-winning Odin feeds his tamed wolves Geri and Freki, but for his part, weapon-loving Odin lives on wine alone. Hugin and Munin, thought and memory Odin's ravens, fly every day the whole world over. Each day I fear that thought Hugin might not return, but I fear more for memory Munin. Valgrind is a holy gate with holy doors upon a field. The gate is old, and there are few who know how it is locked. I think Valhåll has 640 doors, if all are counted. 800 Einherjar will walk through each when the day comes to fight Fenrir. There is a goat named Heidrun who stands on Odin's hall and gnaws the limbs of the tree Larodr. That goat fills Valhåll's cups with bright mead from her udders, and that drink will never diminish. There is a stag named Eikthyrnir who stands on Odin's hall and gnaws the limbs of the tree Larodr. Drops fall from his horns into the well of Hvergelmir. That is the origin of all the rivers. So there are several details here that we can note. I think that just reading you these primary sources and considering them in some detail probably does you a better service than me trying to sketch a picture of the place, because ultimately it really is about 3 poems from the 900s that we're depending on for our understanding of what Valhåll's like. Notice that this is not a paradise. This is certainly a place of honor, but it's not a place of comfort. We see that it is decorated, in fact, sort of made of weapons. The hall is held up by spear shafts, roofed by shields. Chainmail is on the benches instead of straw, right? So typically for a feasting event in the Norse world, we read about this in sagas, they would strew the benches with straw as a more comfortable thing to sit on than the bare wood. But here instead it is chainmail that is strewn upon the benches. Definitely not more comfortable, but part of the martial theme. There is also a wolf hanging above the western door and an eagle above him. The exact significance of these animals hanging there can be difficult to say. Some have seen memories of old Roman legion symbols, though I think that's kind of a stretch since we're talking about more than 500 years since the fall of the Roman Empire. But of course note that these are animals of prey, the wolf and eagle, that are thus associated with battle and with Odin, the fosterer of battle. We see this very specific mention of the name of a cook, the name of the pig whose pork is eaten, and the name of the cauldron in which all of these are made. Their names are actually pretty difficult to understand. Hrimnir is the name of a Jotun or giant, it would mean something like froster. So why exactly you would have a pig named something like Sea Froster, the cauldron being Fire Froster, at least fire I understand, but the names of these are pretty impenetrable. Snorri, in the Prose Edda, where he is quoting and developing from these stanzas in Grímnismál, says that the pork from Sahrimnir never diminishes, so that even though this pig is slaughtered every night to feed the men in Valhåll, he is regenerated every morning, so they just eat him all over again. We also see that this is where Odin's wolves are, Geri and Freki, both of whose names can be read as something roughly like hungry and greedy. But Odin himself does not eat. He lives entirely on wine. So he feeds the wolves with the scraps from the table, Snorri says, with the food that was supposed to be for Odin. This is also where, in the evening, Hugin and Munin, Odin's ravens, return to tell him the news. And there is a specific gate of Valhåll called Valgrind, which makes sense. Grind means gate, so this is the gate of the dead men from the battlefield. And few who know how it is locked. There are 640 doors. This is me translating with the base 1200s. So in older Norse poetry, 100 really means 120. 1,000 thusand really means 1200. I usually assume those older meanings when I'm translating Eddic or Skaldic poetry unless I have a good reason to do otherwise. So you may see somewhat different numbers here than you might see in another translation. And then 800 Einherjar will walk through each when the day comes to fight Fenrir. That's the great wolf that will kill Odin. The original Old Norse says monster, but we can infer that the monster that Odin is thinking about is the monster that's going to eat him, as the specific word used. I don't have text on me right this moment, but I believe it's Gondr, is often used of Fenrir and the other monstrous offspring of Loki. If we take 800 Einherjar, those are the men who are in Valhåll. Ein, alone, or one. Heri, warrior, so these are 800 lone warriors. I like the name. If we multiply 800 by 640, we get something like 500,000, I believe. So that would be then the total capacity of Valhåll when Ragnarok comes. There is also a goat and a stag, a buck, who stand on top of Valhåll, it's top of Odin's Hall, and gnaw the limbs of a tree called Lærðr. Whether this tree should be understood as being Yggdrasil or related to Yggdrasil, the world tree, is hard to say. The tree is not mentioned elsewhere that I can remember. And of course, it is the mead from this goat, Heidrun's udders, that creates, that is drunk by the Einherjar, and that drink will never diminish. So like the pork from Sahrimnir, they never run out of it. And then for whatever particular mythic reason, it is the drops from the horns of the buck Eikthirnir that create the rivers that flow into the well of Hvergelmir. That is also where the original water that was part of the Norse creation myth came from. So Valhåll is in some sense very near to the core of creation. Now before I leave Grímnismál, let me mention, probably the 9th or 10th video I've mentioned this in, that I'm not convinced that the place called Folkvangr, that Odin also mentions in his descriptions of the different halls, is actually different from Valhåll. Here is that stanza in my English translation. Freya rules in the 9th land, Folkvangr. That is where she arranges the seats. She chooses half the dead who die in battle, and Odin takes the other half. Now, this may be different from Valhåll because Gladsheimr, Glad's home, where Valhåll is said to be located, just a couple stanzas before this, is numbered as the 5th land, whereas Folkvangr, which would be something like Army Plain, is numbered as the 9th land. But notice, there may not be a connection between the first and second half of this stanza, even so. So she arranges the seats in that place, and if that is Valhåll, it would make sense that that's where she arranges the seats, chooses where people sit, because she is, at least in some recensions of Norse mythology, Odin's wife. But notice in the last half, it does not say she takes men who die in battle to a different place from Valhall. It says, she chooses half the dead who die in battle, and Odin has the other half. So we don't necessarily know that Folkvanger is a different place where some men who die in battle go. If it is, the only place it is mentioned is Grímnismál. I am not counting Snorri in his prose edda because he mentions it there and does understand it as something different from Valhall, but his only source is transparently Grímnismál, right? Remember, Snorri is in a lot of ways a secondary source. He's just valuable sometimes because he's a secondary source who's 800 years closer to the primary sources than we are. But in this case, Snorri is being led entirely by the stanza in Grímnismál. We do not have further support in our sources of Norse myth for Folkvanger is a different afterlife than Valhall. Plus, I believe Freya may well be the chief of the Valkyries. She may be, in fact, the same as Gondul the Valkyrie. See my video on Valkyries, which I posted last week, for more insight on that. Now, I mentioned there are two other poems from the 900s in which we read about Valhåll. These are both written in commemoration of fallen Norwegian kings. The first is called Eiríksmál, literally words of Eirik, and it is a poem in Eddic style. Not all Edda style poems are in the Poetic Edda, commissioned in memory of Norwegian king Eirikr Blóðugs, Eric Bloodaxe, by his wife Gunhildr after he died in AD 954. The poem is not preserved in its entirety, but the 9 stanzas that do survive paint a picture of Odin preparing Valhåll for Eirik's arrival while speaking to Bragi, the god of poetry that is briefly introduced in Lokasenna, and also the famous human heroes from the saga of the Volsungs, Sigmundur and Sinfjotli. Because this entire thing is relevant to Valhåll, and because the poem can be quite confidently dated to the actual time of Eirik's death in the 950s, I'm just going to read you all 9 of these stanzas in my original English translation. The text of this is also available as a reward on my Patreon page. Odin said, "What is this thunderous noise? I awoke before dawn, and Valhåll was quiet. I woke up my champions, I told them to rise, to spread hay on the benches and prepare the beer. I told the Valkyries to serve wine for a king's arrival. It looks like kings of men are arriving from Midgardr, some excellent warriors. My heart is cheered to see them. Bragi, do you hear it? As if 1,000 men or more were coming?" Bragi said, "The benches creak with the crowd sitting on them, as if Baldr were coming home." Odin said, "I don't want to hear foolishness from you, wise Bragi. You know well who it is. This noise means it's Eirikr. That king is coming here to me in Valhåll. Sigmundur, Sinfjotli, get up quickly and greet the king. Tell him to come in if it is Eirikr. I have great hope that it is." Sigmundur said, "Why are you more eager to see Eirikr than any other king?" Odin said, "Because Eirikr has reddened swords and carried a bloody blade across many lands." Sigmundur said, "Why not give him victory if he is so outstanding?" Odin said, "Because I never know when the grey wolf Fenrir will come to the walls of Osgardr." Sigmundur said, "Hail, Eirikr, you are welcome and come freely to our hall. I'd like to ask what kings those are. Who follows you there, coming in from the battle?" Eirikr said, 5 kings, and I know the names of them all, and I myself am the 6th. Now, first of all, in that very first stanza from this translation, you'll notice that hay is spread on the benches, not chainmail. And so, at least in some conceptions of Valhåll, or at least perhaps when a king is welcomed there the first time, or maybe this is just for kings or other notable people, the benches actually are spread comfortably. Of course, I also think that we can be more confident that Eiríksmál is actually old than Grímnismál is, so this could also represent a somewhat older conception of the place as having some creature comforts. We do see, of course, that there is a justification for Odin gathering the Einherjar. He wants them to help him fight against his enemies at Ragnarok, particularly the monsters such as Fenrir and Jormungandr. And we see that the men in Valhåll are even a little bit unclear about it themselves, right? Sigmundur asks him why he's having him come to Valhåll instead of giving him victory if he's so outstanding, and Odin explicitly acknowledges, because I never know when the grey wolf Fenrir will come to the walls of Osgarðr, the realm of the gods. By the way, establishing that Valhåll, whatever the nature of Glaðsheimr is, it is a place within Osgarðr, the enclosure of the Aesir, the realm where the gods live. Now I'm also going to read you a related poem from a few decades later called Hákonarmál, Words of Hákon. This is of similar style and content. It is composed in memory and honor of Norwegian King Hákon the Good, Hákon Góði, after his death in AD 961 at the Battle of Fitjar on the island of Stur. The poem is attributed to Oyvind the Plagiarist, Oyvindr Skoldaspiller, and it is preserved in its entirety in Snorri Sturluson's saga of Hákon the Good, which is in his collection called Heimskringla. This poem presents a vision of Hákon's welcome arrival in Valhåll, somewhat like Eiríksmál does with Eiríkr, but it's actually a little bit longer, a little bit more detailed. We get some Valkyries get some lines, and it concludes with a stanza that is very similar language to the first half of stanzas 76 and 77 of Hávamál and the Poetic Edda, the famous cows die, kinsmen die. Now, the fact that the composer of this poem is called Hákon the Good, the fact that the composer of this poem is called Oyvindr Skoldaspiller, Oyvindr the Plagiarist, has suggested to many that if he has the same line as another poem has, he is the stealer, because otherwise how would he come to be known as the plagiarist? So this also helps us date Hávamál, or at least Gestaþottr, the main moral wisdom part of Hávamál, to earlier than 961 when Hákon the Good died. Note also, as an aside about this, that Hákon the Good was a Christian. So even though he was not a missionary king like Ólafur Tryggvason, who would follow and who would forcefully convert Iceland and much of Norway, he was a Christian. He did privately practice the Christian faith, so this represents a profound ignoring of his actual religion. All right, here is Hákonarmál in my original English translation. Odin sent his Valkyries, Gondul and Skogul, to choose a king from the Yngling clan to go with Odin and live in Valhåll. They found Bjorn's brother, Hákon, in his armor, a great king beneath his war banners. The spears stood ready and shook. The battle began. That killer of kings called on men from every part of Norway, and went forth to fight. That good king, enemy of Danes, stood beneath his helmet with his good band of Norwegian warriors. That leader of men stripped off his armor, threw his chainmail to the earth before the battle. In his golden helmet, the cheerful king would defend his realm from his enemies. The good sword in that king's hand struck through armor as if through water. Wooden shields creaked and burst into fragments, and their swords thundered as they split the skulls of men. Shields and heads were crushed under marching feet, and the swords of Hákon's men. There was war on the island of Stur. The kings reddened shields in their enemies' blood. Wounds spread like wildfire, and axes prescribed the ends of lives. A tide of wounds came in on a beach of swords, and a flood of spears drowned the shore of Stur. Clouds swirled in the sky above the battle. They fought hard at the red edge of heaven. Spears whined through the sky above the fighters, and many a man knelt and died from swordplay. The dead warriors sat, pierced with arrows, with broken shields and their swords in hand. That army did not walk cheerfully on the roads to Odin in Valhåll. The Valkyrie Gondul spoke, leaning on a spear. Odin's army grows, now that Hákon and his great army is invited to Osgarðr. The king heard what the famous Valkyries were saying on horseback. They were clad in helmets, and they were cheerful, holding shields at their side. Hákon said, "Geirskogul, why did the battle go this way? The gods owed me a victory." The Valkyrie replied, "We did give you victory, and your enemies have fled." The great Valkyrie Skogul said, "It's time for us to ride to the green homes of the gods, and tell Odin that the king is coming to pay him a visit. Odin said, Hermóður, Bragi, go and greet the king. A ruler is coming, looking like a champion, here to my hall. The king spoke then, newly arrived from battle, standing soaked in blood. Odin seems evil-minded to me, for I seem to perceive what his intentions are. Bragi said, You are welcome among all Odin's chosen. Now accept the god's good ale, and look, killer of kings, 8 of your brothers are already here. Hákon said, I would like to keep my weapons, but take good care of my helmet and armor, and keep them within my reach. Then it was proven how well the king had honored the holy places, when all the gods made Hákon welcome in their halls in Ósgarður. It was a good day when such a king was born with such a spirit. The time of his rule will always be remembered as a good era in Norway. Fenrir, the monstrous wolf, will come unchained and terrorize Midgardr before another king as good as Hákon rules in Norway. Cows die, kinsmen die, and our lands and properties are destroyed by enemies. Since Hákon left us to be with the heathen gods, the Norwegian people suffer. So here again the imagery is similar to Eiríksmál. We have Valkyries coming down to take Hákon to Valhåll. The Valkyries actually get names. We hear Gondul, Skogul, and Geirskogul, all known Valkyrie names from the lists in Eiríksmál and Völuspá. The Valkyries actually get lines in this case, especially Gondul, who seems to be sort of the chief Valkyrie and may in fact be in some understandings of Norse myth from the time Freya. And once again we find that one of the Einherjar, in this case Hákon the Good himself, is wondering why, if Odin favored him, he was killed. And of course we get the same understanding that this is because Odin is building up his chosen army in order to fight his enemies, such as Fenrir at Ragnarok. And then at the end, we see that Fenrir, the monstrous wolf, will come unchained and terrorize Midgardr before another king as good as Hákon rules in Norway. So we're also being told there will in fact never be a better king. This is a poem by someone who truly loved and adored his ruler, but not his religion. Still, it's a monument to a Norwegian poet's understanding of what Valhåll and a welcome to it might be like as of the early 960s, and so it is extremely valuable to us. Let me conclude by mentioning that there may well be pictorial representations of Valhåll dating from a time roughly contemporary with these poems, Eiríksmál and Hákonarmál at least. One of the most notable is the picture stone from Allskog Kängvida. I'm sure there's Swedes today who would say Kängvida, from near Ljugarn on the island of Gotland. This dates from the 900s probably, and at the bottom of the stone you can see a well-manned Viking ship, but at the top there is a man riding an 8-legged horse. That may well, of course, be Odin on Sleipnir. There's not many other 8-legged horses. He is being greeted by a woman. We can tell from her dress and hair this is a woman who is holding out a mead horn to him. And he is entering a place that, well, we can see a hall somewhat in the background. We can see some men fighting. We see what looks like a wolf or a dog, and then also someone flying over him, perhaps a Valkyrie or perhaps a man newly arrived to Valhåll. You can find really high quality pictures of this online, for instance at Wikimedia Commons. I'm getting a little bit more chary about picking people's Creative Commons or quote-unquote public domain pictures from there, just because, you know, attribution desires change and things like that, and I don't want a video to go out of date in terms of permissions, reproducing pictures, and I don't have a picture myself. But you can find a picture very easily, for instance on, like I said, Wikimedia Commons is a good place to look, at least in January 2019. Well, I hope this has been a useful and informative look for you at the actual medieval sources of the notion of Valhåll, some of which we can quite confidently date to the Viking Age, and Grímsnithmál probably too. I think there's plenty of language in there that looks a lot older than its 1200s manuscript, the Codex Regius. Same as many other poems in the Poetic Edda, like Völuspá, Hávamál, etc. And I hope that if you enjoyed this video, you'll also check out one of the more than 270 other videos on my channel about all aspects of Norse language, myth, and culture, and that you'll look at my translations of the Norse myths and their original sources. I've done the Poetic Edda and the Saga of the Volsungs with the Saga of Ragnar Lothbrok already. Those are also available as audiobooks narrated by me. And I am working on the Saga of Hervor and Haetheric with the Saga of Rolf Kraki, as well as, in the very near future, the Prose Edda. So those will be available in the next few years. My videos are supported by my generous Patreon supporters. I hope that you'll check out my Patreon page, where you can also find the full text translations of Eiríksmál and Hákonarmál. For now, from beautiful Colorado, I'm wishing you all the best.